There is a clay tablet sitting in a glass case in room 55 of the British Museum. It is barely larger than a hand. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. Its surface is covered in cuneiform script, arranged in 8 neat segments, like a pie chart pressed into wet clay nearly 3,000 years ago. But this tablet does not read like a religious text. It does not read like a poem or a prayer. It reads like a technical document. 2 researchers, both aerospace engineers rather than classicists, decided to take its contents seriously. What they found was a date, a trajectory, and a location. The trajectory ends in a valley in the Austrian Alps, where one of the largest prehistoric landslides in Europe sits with no agreed cause. Today, we are going to walk through what the tablet actually says and where its lines point. The object itself is catalogued as the planisphere of Nineveh. It measures roughly 14 centimeters across, small enough to hold in one hand, and it was excavated in the 1850s by the British archaeologist Henry Layard from the ruins of the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. It has been in the British Museum ever since, sitting in room 55, accessible to anyone who walks in off the street. What sets it apart from the other tablets around it is the layout. The cuneiform on its surface is not arranged in lines or columns the way most Mesopotamian texts are. It is divided into 8 segments, arranged like a pie chart pressed into clay. Each segment contains a different category of information: star names, constellation references, rising and setting times, angular measurements, and what appear to be trajectory calculations, the kind of numerical data you would record if you were tracking a moving object across the sky against the background of fixed stars. There is no mythology in the text, no gods, no rituals, no poetry. The contents read like a technical record. Now, here is where the strangeness begins. As a physical object, the tablet itself dates to around 700 BCE, the period of Ashurbanipal's library. That much is settled. But the astronomical data carved into it does not match the sky of 700 BCE. The specific configurations of stars referenced, the exact relationships between known constellations and the recorded observations do not correspond to anything an observer in Nineveh could have seen on the night the tablet was made. The sky on the tablet belongs to a different night entirely, and modern software can tell us exactly which one. The method for dating an ancient astronomical record is straightforward in principle. Modern software can reconstruct the precise configuration of the night sky for any date in history. Astronomers use this software to plan observations. Historians use it to verify or date ancient records that mention eclipses, planetary alignments, or specific stellar positions. The technique is well established and the results are reproducible. Anyone with the right program and the relevant data can run the calculation and see the same answer. When the stellar positions recorded on the planisphere of Nineveh are fed into this software, the result is unambiguous. The configuration on the tablet does not match the sky of 700 BCE when the tablet was physically made. It does not match anything close to that period. The sky described on the tablet corresponds to a specific night approximately 2,400 years earlier. The date the calculation produces is June 29th, 3,123 BCE. Sit with that for a moment. Someone observed the sky on that night more than 5,000 years ago and recorded what they saw with enough precision that the data still works as a timestamp today. The observation was preserved. It was copied. It was passed from scribe to scribe, generation to generation, across more than 2 millennia of Mesopotamian civilizational history. And eventually, it was housed in the greatest library of the ancient world, where it sat until a British archaeologist dug it out of the ground in the 19th century. Astronomical records are not casually copied for 24 centuries. Routine observations get lost, forgotten, discarded. Whatever was recorded on this tablet mattered enough that successive generations of Mesopotamian scribes refused to let it disappear. The question is, What could possibly justify that level of preservation? The two researchers who answered that question were not classicists. They were not historians of the ancient Near East. They were aerospace engineers. Their names are Alan Bond and Mark Hempsell, and their backgrounds matter to the story. Bond is an aerospace engineer who has spent his career working on rocket propulsion systems. Hempsell is a spacecraft systems engineer who has worked with the European Space Agency. These are not fringe figures. These are people who read trajectory calculations and angular measurements professionally. They look at numerical data describing objects moving through space the way a translator looks at a familiar language. And here is where the difference in literacy becomes everything. For more than a century, scholars who examined the planisphere of Nineveh approached it through the lens of religion and mythology. They saw an unusual tablet covered in star names and assumed they were looking at some form of astrological or ceremonial document. The numerical content was treated as decorative or symbolic rather than functional. When Bond and Hempsell looked at the same tablet, they saw something different. They saw a record of someone tracking a moving object across the sky. They saw position data taken at multiple points in time. They saw angular measurements of the kind a modern observer would record if they were following the path of an asteroid or a comet. From an engineering perspective, the 8 segments were not 8 ritual divisions. They were 8 separate observations of the same object as it crossed the sky. Their analysis was published in 2008 by Alcuin Press, a real academic press with peer review. The methodology was described in enough detail that any astronomer with the appropriate software could check the work. And when the trajectory was projected forward, the path led somewhere specific. Consider what the 8 segments actually contain. The object is observed at one position against the background stars, then another, then another. 8 separate data points spread across enough time for a moving body to shift visibly against the fixed sky. From those points, a path can be reconstructed. Bond and Hempsell did exactly that. They took the angular measurements, the positions relative to known reference stars, the implied speeds and directions, and they assembled the data into a single continuous trajectory. The path they produced has specific characteristics. The object entered the atmosphere at a shallow angle, it crossed the Mediterranean, it traveled north over the Alps, and when the trajectory is projected forward to its logical conclusion, it ends at a specific valley in the Austrian Tyrol. The valley is called Köfels. It is not a famous place. Most people have never heard of it. But to geologists, Köfels is significant for one reason. It is the site of one of the largest prehistoric landslides in Europe. Approximately 9 cubic kilometers of material broke away from the surrounding mountain and filled the valley floor. That is a volume almost beyond imagination. Enough rock to bury a small city. The dating of the landslide itself carries some uncertainty. Some estimates place the event around 9,800 years ago. Others put it somewhat later. The geological record allows for a range rather than a single fixed date. But here's the part that matters. The cause of the Köfels landslide has never been definitively established. Normal landslide mechanisms, the things that usually trigger this kind of slope failure, struggle to account for the volume of material involved. Something extraordinary happened in that valley, and we still do not know what it was. The geological evidence at Köfels is unusual in a very specific way. Scattered across the deposit, embedded in the rock that filled the valley, there is melted material, stone that was heated to extreme temperatures, then resolidified. The rock did not just break and fall. Some of it was cooked. This feature has been used to argue both sides of the debate. Researchers who favor the impact hypothesis point to the melted rock as evidence of an event with extraordinary heat, the kind of heat consistent with an atmospheric detonation or a high-energy impact. Researchers who reject the impact hypothesis argue that the melting could have been generated by friction, by the immense energy released as 9 cubic kilometers of rock tore loose and slid down the mountain. Both positions are defended in the literature. Neither has produced a consensus. The largest prehistoric landslide in Europe still has no agreed cause. Some researchers have proposed a different mechanism altogether. A meteor airburst. A detonation in the atmosphere above the valley, where an incoming object explodes before reaching the ground and releases a pressure wave powerful enough to destabilize the entire mountain slope. The mountain does not need to be hit directly. The shock wave does the work. And this is where the two stories meet. Bond and Hempsel estimated the object on the planisphere at approximately 1 kilometer in diameter, based on the trajectory data. They calculated that it entered at a shallow angle, crossed the Mediterranean, and either impacted in the Köfels Valley or detonated in an airburst directly above it with sufficient force to trigger the landslide. An ancient tablet describing a trajectory, a modern landslide with no agreed cause, 2 independent lines of evidence converging on the same place. When Bond and Hempsel published their analysis in 2008, the academic response was essentially silence, followed by dismissal. The two are not the same thing, and the difference matters. Refutation requires real engagement. It requires checking the specific calculations, running the astronomical software, demonstrating exactly where the methodology produces incorrect results, and publishing the counter-evidence in a form that can be examined and tested by anyone willing to do the work. Dismissal requires only a label: fringe, speculative, methodologically unsound. The label does not need to be defended. It only needs to be applied. The second is significantly easier than the first, and the second is what happened. Consider what has not been published in the years since. No counter-calculation has appeared showing that the star positions recorded on the tablet correspond to a different date. No alternative trajectory analysis has been produced showing that the reconstruction of the object's path is incorrect. No competing theory for the cause of the Köfels landslide has been published that accounts for the melted rock and the volume of displaced material more convincingly than the airburst hypothesis. The aerospace engineers who decoded the tablet have not been shown to be wrong. Their book has been largely ignored. And yet the deliberate preservation of this object is itself a piece of evidence. Ashurbanipal's library was not assembled casually. The king sent scribes across Mesopotamia specifically to copy and keep the most significant texts of the ancient world. Whatever was carved into this small clay disc was judged important enough to be transmitted across more than 2 millennia, recopied by generation after generation of scribes, and finally housed in the greatest library the ancient Near East ever produced. The tablet is still there. The valley is still there. Return to the small clay object in room 55. The tablet is 14 centimeters across. It fits in one hand. It has been accessible to any researcher, any visitor, anyone willing to stand in front of it for more than 170 years. The calculation that placed its astronomical data on June 29, 3123 BCE has been published, and it has not been refuted. The landslide it appears to describe has no agreed cause. The engineers who decoded it have not been shown to be wrong. There is a sentence that has never appeared in any mainstream documentary, any museum description, any popular treatment of Mesopotamian astronomy. This may be the only surviving ancient eyewitness record of a catastrophic asteroid impact. The tablet is still in room 55. The valley in Austria is still there. The question of what crossed the sky that night is still open.